Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be wrapping up part 2 of my review of the SPRIME PM1, the sleeper ergo mouse that came out of nowhere really, and from an on-paper standpoint seemed a little too good to be true. Now before we get into it, I did want to say a big thank you again to SPRIME, who was kind enough to send over the PM1 for review. I greatly appreciate it. Now as usual with the channel, everything you see here on the channel I will give you my unbiased opinion of. I will not be biased towards a specific brand because of a discounted or a free unit. You will always get the truth about everything you see here on the channel, and as per usual the video will be fully subtitled and timestamps will be available down in the description. But let's go ahead and get right into our deep dive of the SPRIME PM1 to see if this mouse is really too good to be true. We'll start off talking about how this mouse performed in game. Now in terms of in-game performance, the PM1 is an ergo and that is my preferred shape, so I felt right at home here with the PM1. As such, the mouse performed exceptionally well. I absolutely loved using this mouse in game. It was just a very comfortable mouse that I'm very familiar with, that felt amazing for my aim style, super solid for both static and dynamic aiming across the board. It was just a really well performing mouse. Now I will say the PM1 is a very light mouse, and that did take a little time for me to get accustomed to, especially because I was using the PM1 on the LGG Neptune and the Razer Strider, both of which are rather fast pads. So I did have to adjust my centimeter per 360 to kind of help speed up the adjustment process. I went from around 40 centimeter to 60 centimeter per 360, but once I did get accustomed to the mouse, it just felt amazing. Just the lightness of the mouse does take a little time to get accustomed to. Overall, the PM1 performed exceptionally well. I really have no complaints about how it performed in game. It just felt great. I'm very interested to see how the 8K polling performance is going to be on the PM1 when that is released, because currently the mouse is capped to 1K and they are releasing an 8K dongle later. So I'm very interested to see how that polling rate implementation is, because if it's really well implemented, the PM1 is going to feel even better with high polling rate, but we'll have to see how it's implemented when it does come out, and I'll cover that in a future video whenever that dongle does release. Now, one of the reasons I love the PM1 so much is the shape, because it is a very familiar ergo shape for me. So let's dive into why the shape of the PM1 is so good next. Now, the thing that made the PM1 feel so good for me was the shape, and that is kind of the star of this mouse in my opinion, because it is just such a great ergonomic shape. But surprisingly, the shape of the PM1 is actually very similar to the MP01S and the Keychron M2, but instead of the ergo symmetrical shape we saw on those mice, the PM1 is a true tilted ergo mouse. When I reviewed both the MP01S and the Keychron M2, the thing I wished on both those mice is I wish they were both true ergonomic mice, because the hybrid shape wasn't ideal, and having such a similar shape here on the PM1, just a true ergo, is essentially perfect, and I absolutely love the shape. It is just like the best possible shape you could have for an ergo mouse. Another really interesting thing about the PM1 shell is that the rear shell is very egg-like with how it feels. Now, egg-like is definitely a bit of a weird term, but what I mean by that is that the hump is rounded, but it's a lot taller than you commonly see on a lot of mice, meaning that when it comes to contact, it makes more of a thinner, taller contact point than a shorter, wider contact point that we've seen on other mice. Now, I will say there is a bit of a raised lip towards the end of the PM1 shell where the top shell and the bottom shell meet. It does jut out just a little bit. Now, personally speaking, I never felt the lip with my hands, but I have very big hands and I don't commonly feel the lips. But if you're someone who's sensitive to the lip and you do have smaller hands, you may notice that on the PM1. Now, as I mentioned before, this egg-like kind of hump on the back of the PM1 did take a little while for me to get accustomed to, but once I did get accustomed to the shape, it just felt so good. I actually prefer the thinner, higher contact point rather than the shorter, wider contact point a lot of mice, because it works a little better for my hand size. Again, I have very big hands, so that may not be the story for everyone, but I do really like the hump design on the PM1, and I just overall the shell just felt extremely solid. For this being SPRIME's first mouse, I am shocked with how good this shell is, because we've seen other companies like Keychron release like 7 mice and they haven't really been able to nail the shell down perfectly, whereas SPRIME just has an incredibly solid ergo shell right out of the gate. Props to SPRIME here, they absolutely killed it with the shell design on the PM1. Again, it is a little unique from a lot of other mice we've seen with this very tall egg-like shape to it, but it is a very well shaped mouse that does perform exceptionally well. Now, while we're speaking on the shell, I did also want to talk about the comparison between the PM1 and the Logitech G703. When the SPRIME was first announced, people were comparing it a lot to the 703 because it does have a lot of similarities in the shape and is kind of a successor to that, if that makes sense. Kind of like what we saw with the WiseOwl OGM Cloud, where it's like a successor to the SteelSeries Sensei 10. A lot of people were saying that the SPRIME PM1 is going to be a successor to the Logitech G703. The PM1 does share a lot of similarities with the shell of the 703. I guess you could call it like a 703 mini to a degree, but I do think that the hump design on the PM1 does separate itself enough from the shell on the G703 to make it more of a unique mouse. So of course, while there are similarities between the 703 and the PM1, I think the PM1 is more of its own thing. It's not a pure clone of the 703, it's kind of its own shape and its own design, if that makes sense. I think that people who did like the 703 will still like the PM1, but don't expect a one-for-one clone because there are a lot of differences between the two shells. All right, now in terms of compatible grips, the PM1 is a fairly averagely sized ergo mouse coming in at 120 millimeters by 60 millimeters by 40 millimeters. In terms of compatible grip style, styles, I'd say the SPRIME PM1 is well optimized for palm and claw grips for smaller hands. For medium hands, the PM1 is optimized for pretty much every grip out there. So fingertip, claw, palm grips, anything is going to go because it is a very well-sized shell. And for people with larger hands, the PM1 is well suited for fingertip grips and claw grips. I will say that overall, the PM1 is definitely designed for medium-sized hands. It's not going to be like the Wise Owl Cloud where it's made for larger hands, or a mini version of a mouse is only for smaller hands. It is definitely well versed for medium-sized hands overall because it's going to be compatible with the most grip styles with a medium-sized hand. So it's a well-sized mouse. It does work for every hand size, but it's definitely optimized for medium-sized hands in my opinion. Alrighty, now I also wanted to talk about the contact point or contact zones on the PM1 here. I did kind of talk about this earlier in the review, but I did want to have a dedicated section to it. Now, in terms of contact zones, as I mentioned before, the tall egg-like rear hump of the PM1 makes a primary contact with my mid to lower palm region. The rear flare does make decent contact with the mid to lower thenar region of my hand. Interestingly enough, though, the PM1 doesn't make a lot of contact with the mid to lower hyperthenar, which is very odd. With a lot of other mice in the market with their thinner and wider rear humps, you commonly see a lot of the contact area being on the thenar and the hyperthenar and less of a reliance on mid palm contact. But this is kind of flipped with the PM1 where its contact area is more reliant on the thenar and the mid palm than it is on the hyperthenar, which is very interesting. Now, it's not to say there's not any contact on the hyperthenar. There still is a little bit of contact. But if you end up getting the PM1, expect a lot more mid palm contact and thenar contact than you would see on the hyperthenar contact. It may take some time to get accustomed to that difference in feeling, but it does really help with the overall feel of the mouse and helps it feel a lot more stable in your hand, which is really awesome to see. Now, contact zones are of course important when it comes to a mouse's shape and how it feels in the hand, but one other factor that's also very important is the coating. So let's talk about the PM1's coating next. Now, one area where we've seen a lot of mixed results in with a lot of mice in the market recently is in coatings, but thankfully the PM1 is not following suit of the rest of the market here. The PM1's coating is this very fine grit coating. To the hand, there isn't much of a texture on it, but it does actually have a surprisingly grippy coating. It's not sticky, it's more of just like a friction resistant coating, kind of like a sandpaper, if that makes sense, but it does actually work extremely well. Now, the coating does get slightly slippery and moisture is applied to it, so people with very sweaty hands may have some grip issues, but one big benefit of this is that while the coating isn't ideal with moisture, the PM1 not being super reliant on thenar and hyperthenar contact really does help here, where the middle palm contact, because it kind of fits in this archway in the middle of your hand, does kind of prevent it from slippering. So even though the coating isn't amazing when it comes to moisture resistance, it still works really well because the shell is so tall and so high. The PM1 does also include a set of grips in the box. It does come with 2 sides and 2 click coverings. Now, this grip tape actually feels very similar to the grip tape we found on the OGM Cloud. However, it's a little thinner, which I actually don't mind. The texturing is okay, but because it's so thin, there isn't a lot of depth to the texturing, so you can't push too deep into it to get a lot of grip, but it is actually surprisingly good. It is definitely better at dealing with moisture than the coating of the PM1 is, but it's still not the best. So while these aren't like the best grip tape in the world, they're definitely a cut above a lot of the other included grips to see with a lot of mice. They're not perfect, but they are better. But overall, I do think people will be completely fine with either the stock coating on the SPRIME itself. If the stock coating doesn't work, the included grips are going to work completely fine. Again, you will obviously be better off getting an aftermarket set like the X-Ray Pad Cicada Wings or Gecko 2.0s. But overall, for stock grip tape, these are really solid overall. SPRIME did a really good job with the coating and the included grips here with the PM1. All right, now let's talk build quality and QC. Now, to be completely honest with you, I was a little concerned about the PM1 in terms of build quality and QC because this is one of the first polycarbonate shell mice we've seen coming to the market, and I did have some concerns about the rigidity and the long-term durability of the shell, but I'm actually very surprised to find out that the PM1 is actually very well built and very well QC'd. This thing actually feels like a truck. I will say, because it is a polycarbonate shell, there is a little more flex to the overall unit that you'd expect on a hard shell plastic mouse. Nothing that you'll notice in game, but if you do press into the material, it does give in a little more than plastic does. I would be careful if you're like death gripping this mouse because there is a chance you could potentially break it. But over generally, I didn't notice any kind of inconsistencies or flexing or creaking that caused any issues on my PM1. It was actually very well constructed. Now, while the QC on my unit is perfect, which is really awesome to see, I love the way my unit feels, I did want to mention one small QC issue that's affecting other units. Apparently, around 1% of the PM1s out there do have a squeaking issue with the right main click. Now, SPRIME did actually make a public announcement about this issue already, where they said they're going to be RMAing all the affected units, which is a massive W for a brand new company like SPRIME. This is how warranty issues like this, like a sticky click or a squeaky click should be handled. So I feel like a lot of companies can be learning from SPRIME here, because this is a huge W from them. They could have easily just ignored this because it is a very, very minimal thing, but they're still RMAing all those units, which is really awesome. So if you got a SPRIME and you do have an issue where your right click does squeak a little bit, send a video to their support team and they will RMA their mouse. So big W to SPRIME there. That's really awesome to see. And aside from them doing the right thing and RMAing the units, this is also a really good sign for the future of SPRIME as well, because a lot of companies out there, if you have a minor issue like this, they will not help you. The fact that SPRIME is kind of setting a precedent now on their first mouse release that they're going to take care of customers to this level is really promising to see, which makes me very excited to see what SPRIME is going to do in the future. But in terms of build quality and QC, no complaints. Everything feels solid on my unit, and the fact that SPRIME is taking care of anyone else who does have an affected unit is a really cool precedent to see, and hopefully they continue to do that in the future. Alrighty, next up, let's talk about the weight of the PM1. Now, I will say I did notice some inconsistencies with the weight advertisements here, because the box of my PM1 came in said the mouse weighed 43 plus minus 2 grams. And then when I weighed my PM1 with my X-ray pad Obsidian donuts on it, my mouse came in at 44.6 grams. Now, of course, if I was to keep the regular stock skates on there, it would probably be a little heavier, and if I put the control skates on, it would also add another 2.35 grams. This is one area where SPRIME has kind of missed the mark with the weight advertisements. I honestly rather than advertise the weight as 45 grams and have the mouse weigh actually 44.6 or 44.3, rather than advertise the mouse as 43, 44 grams and have the mouse actually weigh heavier than that. It would be nice to see them kind of clean up the marketing so there was a consistent marketing of what the weight is, because on SPRIME's website, it does say 43 grams still. Again, this is kind of an issue that's everywhere. Pretty much every single mouse out there doesn't have accurate weight measurements, which is really frustrating. I'd rather see them advertise the mouse as 44 or 45 grams rather than the current 43 grams, because it's not really accurate. Alrighty, let's talk about one of my favorite highlights of the PM1. That's going to be the main click implementation. Now, I'll give you a quick little sound test here. Now, the main click switch here is an mel0n switch. Surprisingly, I actually haven't used mel0ns in my time reviewing it, but I'm actually really, really impressed with these switches. They are opticals, of course. They're very light, very snappy with a great rebound. The lightness of the clicks did take some time for me to get accustomed to because they are very, very sensitive. I honestly love the click implementation. These mel0n switches feel so good and they're really responsive. They just really felt fantastic. The main clicks do have a little bit of pre-travel and minimal post-travel. You can, of course, push the click down to get more post-travel, but that's not anything you're going to find during normal use. But the click is consistent, feels amazing across the entire shell click. They are just really, really, really well implemented shell clicks. Now, the shell clicks are these wavy semi-convex clicks. The concaveness that does kind of naturally guide your fingers to the middle of the click, which is really nice to see. Now, the main clicks do share the same coating as the rest of the shell, the PM1, so your fingers don't slip at all on the main buttons. The main clicks are also really well stabilized too. There is an ever so slight play left to right on them, but they're very, very solidly implemented. Overall, no issues with wobbling or anything that would affect usage. But overall, the clicks here are probably one of my favorite main click implementations I've seen in a very, very long time. I can't believe I've been sleeping on mel0n opticals this long, which is crazy, but they feel amazing. Now, I did want to make one quick note here. Since these are optical switches, there is no debounce settings for the clicks here, just like we saw on the optical switches on the Pulsar X2 V2, the X2H, and the Death Adder V3. So if you're looking for debounce settings in the software and you're wondering why there is none, it's because they're opticals. You don't need to adjust it. Alrighty, next up, let's talk about these side buttons. Now, these are fairly similar to the main clicks. They do have a really solid implementation. I'll give you a quick little sound test here. Now, unsurprisingly, the side button switch is a 1.0 white dot switch. This is the side switch we've seen on pretty much every single mouse on the market right now. I will say in terms of the click feeling, the buttons are slightly heavier than the main clicks in terms of actuation weight, but given that they're a 1.0, that makes sense. They have essentially no pre-travel and a very, very minimal post-travel, but they do have a very snappy rebound just like the main clicks do. Now, the side clicks themselves are these surprisingly large and wide side buttons. I actually really, really like the implementation. These commonly see these very small, thin pill-shaped buttons that are just really awkward to actuate, but these ones are very wide, which is really awesome to see. But because the PM1 side buttons share the same coating as the rest of the mouse, and they're these very large side buttons, they're very easy to actuate, and they feel consistent to actuate across the entire button. Now, I will say there is an ever so slight amount of wobble to the buttons. If you put your finger on them, you move them up and down, there's a little bit of play to the left and right, but nothing that's going to affect the actual performance of the click. Again, the clicks are consistent across the entire side buttons. Nothing is going to affect your usage, and they felt super consistent, just super well implemented across all of my testing. No real complaints about the side buttons at all. They did a really good job with them. Alrighty, and let's talk about the scroll wheel and scroll wheel encoder. Now, the encoder for this SPRIME PM1 is a TTC 12mm, and the switch is something very interesting. It is this pillar switch that I've only seen once before. I've only seen it on the Death Adder V3 wired before. I'm going to assume it's a 1.0 of some kind, but I don't know for sure. But regardless, it feels completely fine. The scroll wheel texturing is very grippy. The scroll force is about a medium, I'd say. It's not light, but it's not also super heavy to scroll, and it does have fairly pronounced scroll points. Now, the scroll wheel click, of course, is going to be the heaviest button on the entire PM1, as we commonly see with every mouse on the market right now. The middle click is often the 1-0 red switch, which is very heavy. Same thing here, it's just a weird pillar switch that's probably a 1-0 pillar switch of some variety. I just don't know what it is. No problems with the implementation though, it feels completely fine. It's just a bit of a mystery as to what the switch is. Now, the PM1 is boasting top-line specs, which means it will come as no surprise that the PM1 is using a Pixart 3395 DM-T6QU, the standard sensor we see on pretty much every single mouse on the market right now, and to no shock to anyone, it's using a Nordic 52840 as the MCU. Again, this is the same specs we see on pretty much every single mouse on the market right now, so nothing too surprising there. Now, I will note that the 3395 is an unlocked 3395, so it does have the full unlocked DPI. It's not capped down like the 3395 we saw on the Zowie U2 or the Vaxi mice, so it's only capable of 3200. This is a fully unlocked version. Now, the PM1 3395 does also have motion sync enabled, but it has no options for ripple and angle snapping, which is kind of odd. I don't really use those, so I don't really mind not seeing them here, but for people who rely on them, I don't know if they're enabled by default in the software. There's just no option to turn it on and off. I'm assuming they're just not enabled on this sensor, but I could be wrong. Overall, the implementation of the sensor in the MCU is perfect. As I mentioned before when I talked about gameplay, it feels like a very, very solid performing mouse. I had no issues with any kind of sensor issues or any kind of MCU issues. The PM1 did perform exceptionally well, no problems at all. Now, as I mentioned before in this video, the SPRIME does support 8K polling rate, but currently it's not available because they have not released the dongle for it yet. This unit is currently capped to 1K. I will be making a video about the 8K polling performance when SPRIME does release the dongle, because I'm very, very interested to see how much that boosts the performance, because this mouse already performed exceptionally well, and I'm very interested to see how the high polling rate implementation is. If it's done very well, this mouse is going to perform extremely well, but we'll talk about that more when that dongle does officially release from SPRIME. But while we're talking about the 8K polling rate, I did also want to talk about one other cool feature on the SPRIME PM1, because this mouse does also have an additional performance mode, so let's go ahead and talk about that next. Alrighty, now the PM1 by default is using their high speed connectivity mode, but there is an option for a performance mode inside the software. Now, this is very similar to the Wiseout Cloud and the Vaxi performance modes. They basically do the same thing. Now, just like we've seen with a lot of other performance mode implementations, you cannot use it over USB-C wire connection. It's only on the wireless connection. It is unfortunate to see. It would be nice to see it be available via the wired connection, but it's pretty par for the course for it to be only on wireless, so that is what it is. Now, the performance mode does a couple things. It pretty much just increases the performance of the mouse and increases the anti-interference tech on the wireless connectivity for the mouse, but of course it does cost battery life to do so. So the estimated 80 hours of battery life you're going to get on the PM1 is going to be adjusted down to more around 60 hours with the competitive mode. With the standard high speed mode, it's more around the advertised 80-hour battery life. Now, as I mentioned before, this is something that's really nice to see here on the PM1, because again, we commonly only really see these on higher tier mice like Vaxi mice or the Zowie mice, will also have performance mode as well, but we're starting to see it pop up on other more budget oriented mice like the Wiseout Cloud and of course the SPRIME PM1 here, which is really awesome to see. So I really hope we continue to see this happening from other manufacturers where they add on performance modes, because as I mentioned before, it's really nice to be able to squeeze a little bit of extra performance out of your mouse without relying on 2, 4, and 8K polling rate. It's a really awesome feature to see, and hopefully that'll continue to happen on other developers, not just from SPRIME, but it is a really nice thing to see included here on the PM1. All right, now in terms of stock skates, the SPRIME does come with 2 sets of skates. It comes with a pre-installed speed skate. It comes with an extra set of control skates. Now these are advertised as 0.7mm 100% PTFE skates, but I'm not 100% convinced they are 100% PTFE, because they don't look like the 100% PTFE skates I've seen on other mice, and the stock skates that came on the Sora V2 from the same factory are dyed PTFE. So take SPRIME's claim of 100% PTFE here with a grain of salt. But regardless of what the material composition is of these skates, I actually don't mind the PM1 stock skates at all. Now I would like to see SPRIME do the same thing that the Sora V2 did, where they don't have skates installed on the mouse by default, and you can kind of pick what skate you want to put on, just because if you want to use the control ones, you have to waste the speed ones to get to them, which is rather unfortunate. It just makes a bunch of e-waste. So I'd rather see them have the mouse with no skates on it and then have the user install them, but that's going to be up to them. Now, while the skates on the PM1 are pretty good, one thing I did miss, unfortunately, is that there are no skate removal ramps on the bottom of this mouse, which is rather unfortunate to see. So it would be nice to see them add on skate removal ramps. I'm not really sure why they didn't do that. Maybe the base layer is too thin for them to do so, but that would be something nice to see on future versions of the PM1. But to SPRIME's credit, they did actually do something really cool here, which I really appreciate. Where on the bottom of the PM1, they actually drilled holes out on the bottom of the central ring skate around the sensor. Now, commonly when you try to remove the skates, the ring sensor is the hardest one to remove, because it always leaves adhesive on the bottom and it's a pain in the ass to get it off. But since there are holes cut underneath the skate here on the PM1, it's actually really easy to remove the skate. Now, I'm pretty sure they did this to save weight, but I actually really like this in terms of just serviceability, because it makes it very easy to remove the central ring. So this is an unintentional or intentional really cool thing to see here on the SPRIME. It would be nice to see this also done on the skate cutouts on the top and bottom, but but it is what it is. I'm not super concerned about that, but it's nice to be able to remove the sensor ring skate without any adhesive being left on the bottom. But aside from the lack of removal ramps and the unknown actual true material makeup of the stock skates, they are actually pretty solid overall. I did end up removing my speed skates and putting on the X-ray pad obsidian dots, as those are my preferred skate type, but for stock skates, they're fine regardless of their unknown material makeup. Now, the SPRIME is using a 250 milliamp hour battery, which is a slight change from the standard 300 milliamp hour battery we see in most mice nowadays. That's why the battery life is a little lower than we commonly see on a lot of other mice. Normally we see around 100 hours, but the PM1's coming in more around the 80-hour mark. Now, from my testing, again, with the comp mode, it definitely did drop it down quite a bit. The high speed mode was pretty average in terms of battery life. Overall, I have really no problems with the battery. It did perform completely fine. Again, it's slightly smaller, but that's not really that big of a deal. Now, I do have a little bit of a concern with the battery when it comes to the high polling rate implementation though, because of course, high polling rate does use a lot more battery. I'd be very interested to see how the battery life is on 4 and 8K polling rate, because that already like halves or quarters of battery life you commonly see on a lot of mice. So it'd be very interesting to see how this 250 milliamp hour battery holds up against other mice now the battery life truly is. I'm assuming it's going to be probably more around the 20-30 hour mark with the 4 and 8K polling, but we'll have to see when it does come out, and I'll cover that in the video covering the 8K polling rate performance when that does release in the future. Alrighty, now so far I've been pretty positive about the PM1 overall. Again, this is a really good mouse, but one area I have to heavily criticize is the USB-C port. For whatever reason, the manufacturer or SPRIME themselves decided to alter the USB-C connection here on the PM1, which is just unbelievably frustrating because this mouse in my eyes is essentially perfect, but it has a odd sized USB cable that does not work with universal cables. You have to use the cable that comes with the PM1 or the Sora V2, ironically enough, because they both have the same sized USB port. Now, obviously, aside from this being like one of my major irks with recent gaming mice, having a customized USB-C port is just like the most tilting thing I can see on a mouse in existence, and it's especially tilting here because this mouse is essentially perfect, but it's a much bigger problem for SPRIME specifically because, as I covered in my unboxing video, my USB-C cable that came out of the box was really badly kinked because the way the packaging was designed. So if for whatever reason that cable didn't work when I got my PM1, I wouldn't be able to use the mouse because it doesn't fit with other standard USB-C ports. Thankfully, my cable was okay. I haven't had any problems with it, but this is a big problem. There's absolutely no reason to modify the USB-C port on this mouse. It doesn't even make sense in terms of weight cutting because you're actually adding more shell to account for your custom size cable. You could actually lower the weight of the mouse by using a regular size cable. But unfortunately, this otherwise perfect mouse is marred by a custom USB-C port, which is just incredibly frustrating to see here. Again, I would really like to see SPRIME fix this on future batches of the PM1, and whatever products they decide to make in the future, please make a regular sized USB-C cable. Now, in terms of on-unit controls, there really isn't anything to speak of here aside from a power slider on the bottom of the mouse. So there's not really a lot to talk about on the mouse itself, but there is a lot I can say about the software. Now, the PM1 is one of the first mice we've seen hit the market utilizing web-based software, and this is something that's really awesome. Having web-based software is amazing. It's so easy to use. It's such a nice change of pace from what I commonly see with a lot of mice with that very bloated softwares that are slow and they just don't work properly. Having a super fast web-based software is just amazing to see. Now, I will say as of right now, the web software only works on Edge and Chrome. Firefox and other browsers are unsupported as of right now, but I'm sure they'll be releasing in the future. SPRIME will be releasing a dedicated memory manager program, so if you don't want to use the web-based program, you can use a physical software. As of recording this video, it is not out right now, but I'm assuming it's going to be out in the near future. So when it comes to software, the SPRIME is in a league of its own right now. Again, the only other mouse out on the market right now that does use web-based software is the Sora V2. Surprising, because they're made in the same factory, same tech, same everything. Shocker. I will say the SPRIME does work exceptionally well with their web-based software. It's awesome to see, and I really hope other companies start following suit and making web-based software, because it is just a breath of fresh air, because so many of my softwares are just unbelievably awful. It's just such a nice change of pace to see a very lightweight, super fast web-based software here on the PM1. Alrighty, and lastly, one very important topic I did want to talk about here on the PM1 is serviceability. Now, with this being a new material with the polycarbonate shell, I did have some concerns about the inside because I wasn't sure how this new material is going to play with in terms of taking this mouse apart, but surprisingly, the PM1 is actually very easy to crack open. So this mouse is actually very easy to service and clean on the inside. Unfortunately, the board is completely soldered, so you can't swap encoders or switches and that kind of stuff, but at least it's nice to see despite this new polycarbonate material, the mouse is still very easy to open up. You can still change side buttons, change shell clicks and that kind of stuff, so it's very easy to service the mouse, which is awesome to see. Also, on top of that, it is actually very easy to disassemble this entire mouse as well. I'll talk about that more when I do my teardown of the PM1 coming out shortly after this video goes live, so I'll talk more about that then. Alrighty, now in terms of final thoughts, honestly, I'm really really impressed with the PM1. For this being SPRIME's first mouse, I'm shocked with how many things they did right here. A lot of the times first mouse from a company is not that great and they'd often do a lot of things wrong, but SPRIME really knocked it out of the park with this mouse. Of course, this mouse is not perfect. The advertised weight is inaccurate. The lack of skate ramps is disappointing. Maybe change the stock skates, have them not pre-installed by default will be a welcome change. And of course, the whole USB-C port situation is extremely frustrating to see, but despite the unfortunate shortcomings of the USB-C port being customized, I really love this mouse. It is just such a comfortable ergo. The egg-like tall shell towards the rear of the mouse makes great contact with your palm. It's so easy to hold. It's so lightweight. The coating is great. The clicks are just buttery smooth. There is just so many things they've done right with this mouse, and the mouse is probably going to be even better when the 8K polarity comes out in the future, because it's going to make this mouse perform even better. But overall, the PM1 is essentially the perfect mouse. This is such a good mouse. You'd be doing yourself a disservice not to try this mouse. It is just so good. With how SPRIME is handling QC problems with their first batch and how they're handling customer relations and how they deal with feedback from the community, I'm very hopeful for SPRIME's future, because if this is their first mouse and they knocked out of the park this well, I can't imagine how good their next mice are going to be. If you'd like to learn more about the SPRIME PM1, I will have the product page linked down in the description for you guys to check out. Again, this is an awesome mouse. I highly recommend you check it out. But that is going to be everything for my review of the SPRIME PM1 for today. If you enjoyed the video, please consider leaving a like on the video and maybe subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future videos like the teardown of the PM1 coming in a couple days. And if you'd like to support the channel and everything I'm doing here with my reviews and the teardown project, you can become a member here on YouTube. It's the easiest way to directly support the channel, and you get your name shouted out at the end of videos and a little member section. So if you'd like to support the channel, you become a member here on YouTube. But that is everything for today. Thank you very much again to SPRIME for sending us out for review. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.